Greetings and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to this series on Treasures from Heaven, being an exploratory tour of Christian art and architecture. My name is Bruce Hemmingson, and I will be your moderator today. I'm calling you from Bangkok in Thailand, where I've been living since 1995. I'm married with 4 children. I'm the first APA VM Thailand member, along with my wife Gentana, and also a member of the IDS Medical Group with my colleague and Group CEO Ben Chang. Today we are part of the third of a 4-part lecture series, which is sponsored by the Asian chapter of the Patrons of the Arts of the Vatican Museum. As you might know, the Asian chapter has branch offices in Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Today's topic is the chivalrous cities of Spain's Golden Triangle. Now, if you haven't been to the Golden Triangle of Andalusia, made up of the cities of Seville, Cordoba, and Granada, then you really haven't seen Spain. The Moors occupied Spain for hundreds of years, and their influence on Spanish culture, architecture, music, and language is most notable here in this region. The Mudéjar buildings and palaces in the region are breathtaking and unlike anything you'll likely find in Spain's typical tourist destinations. Mudéjar is a style of Iberian architecture and decoration influenced by Moorish taste and the workmanship. The Alhambra in Granada, Alcazar in Seville, and Cathedral in Cordoba are all examples of this unique style. But before I say any more, I think it's an appropriate moment to introduce our guest presenter for today, Father Michael Collins. So something about Father Michael Collins. He is a priest and author living in Dublin, Ireland. He has a great passion for history, arts, culture, and travel, where somehow he has found time to author several books, including The Vatican Secrets and Treasures of the Holy City, Francis, Bishop of Rome, and Newman, a short biography. Father Michael is a native of Glenageary in South Dublin. He studied at St. Conlath's College before reading Greek and Roman civilization, history, and philosophy at the University College of Dublin. He then read theology and later trained for the priesthood at Holy Cross College, Clonleaf, and was finally ordained in 1985. Since then, he has served in several parishes and had the opportunity of following postgraduate studies at the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology in Rome, and then later taught at a number of universities in Rome. Today, we are again privileged to have Father Michael lead this third lecture out of the 4 on the chivalrous cities of Spain's Golden Triangle, and I'm sure that you're going to enjoy what he's got to say. So please welcome Father Michael for what I know will be an inspiring presentation and discussion with you all. And don't forget to post your questions as we proceed through today's presentation. Father Michael, we welcome you.
It's a pleasure to be with you today, and for our journey today we're going to fly across the Mediterranean Sea, and we're going to go back 1300 years in order to arrive in Spain, which at that time had been a Roman province and had been taken over by the Visigoths, and now is about to change its culture and having an extraordinary influence and an extraordinary influence and an extraordinary impulse of art, of music, of culture, etc. I call this the Golden Triangle because it is a small area in the south of Spain. And as we move into our slides now, I'll be able to show you a map of what the original area looked like at the time of the Muslims fleeing over from Arabia. And if you look at the darkest brown area on our map here, that's Saudi Arabia. That's where the Prophet Muhammad began the teaching of Islam in 622 to 632. Around that period, he introduced a new religion, which was similar to Judaism and Christianity because it traced its origins back to Abraham. And Abraham, if you like, is the father of the three religions of Judaism, of Christianity, and of Islam. And the armies of Islam moved over westwards. First of all, they moved to the north, to the east, and they took over the remnants of the Persian Empire. Then they moved again north and west to take over the remnants of the Roman Empire. And then as they moved into Africa, the north of Africa, they established a new area of rule called the Umayyad Caliphate. But then in 711, they decided to move over into an area which was very attractive to them because Africa had its own charms, its own beauty, etc. But the area of Spain was important for them because it promised a new territory. They were already expanding in Africa, and now they were able to move over the Straits of Gibraltar and into southern Spain. And over a period of 700 years, they took over virtually the entire area of what we would call today Portugal and Spain. Now, 2,200 years ago, it had become a Roman province, and it was entirely Roman, part of the western part of the empire. But in 476, the empire in the west collapsed with the deposition of the last Roman emperor, a young boy, 12-year-old boy, called Romus Augustulus. He was deposed, and then there was an enormous vacuum created in what we would call Central Europe in today's terms. And we're now at the terminus, the Atlantic terminus of that area in Spain. The Visigoths were a German group, a German tribe, which had moved from the north of Europe. They'd moved southwards, perhaps attracted by the weather, perhaps attracted by the food, who knows, but they wanted new space, and they moved across the Pyrenees through France into Spain, and they took over that whole area. Now, the Muslims arrived, therefore, in 711, and of course, you can't just arrive somewhere and expect everybody to just open up their doors and say you're very welcome. There was a battle, the Battle of Guadalete, and the king at that time, Roderick, had been conquered and had to surrender that whole area. Now, the interesting thing was, at that period, from about the 2nd century to the period we're talking about, the 5th century, Spain was largely Christian. The new arrivals, of course, were Muslim. This was an Islamic expansion. So therefore, the new arrivals, who had actually, when they were sweeping across the northern part of Africa, they'd actually absorbed Berbers and other tribes who converted to Islam, because this was the new kid on the block, if you like, and they wanted to come up and establish a new area. And one of the interesting things, if we look at history, is so often religions are connected with land and property and money. So if you're on the winning slide, you want to move over, you want to get your opportunity to see whatever you can establish. And therefore, if we see King Roger Ricard on our left-hand side converting, but then look at the maps on either side, you'll see by the end of the 8th century, virtually the whole of Spain had become an emirate of Cordoba. And Cordoba was one of the towns which we're going to see, which was very important in establishing the move of an administration, setting up a new language, setting up a new way of administering, of taking taxes. And taxes, of course, are terribly important. The Muslims were very intelligent, because when they came over, obviously they terrified everybody with the storm of their arrival, with these armed soldiers, and the locals, I presume, were worried what was going to happen to them. But curiously, the Muslims were very wise and shrewd, because they offered what the Romans had done before. They said, okay, you can remain with your traditions, with your lands, with etc., etc., but all you've got to do is you've got to pay us a certain amount of money. It's an annual tax. So therefore, it made a lot of sense. The new rulers were able to allow the people continue on in their work. They were able to do what they had been doing for centuries before. And then all they had to do was come every year and offer a general tribute. And here we have a tribute being received. The tribute then was put into the coffers, and then the new rulers were able to make these people work for them, and yet at the same time the locals were very glad to work for them because they felt they were getting protection. So it was a little bit of a protection racket, not a very happy one, but nevertheless it was to lay down the foundations of the Arab world which we see today. Now, I mentioned Cordoba was the first place where the Umayyad Caliphate set up its headquarters, and this became a very important area because it allowed them access to the sea. It wasn't very far from the sea. It allowed them also access into the interior of Spain. So from here, the ruler was able to command every part of the Spanish territory. I've chosen here just to concentrate on the art rather than the history, because the history is extremely complex, as you could imagine, and trying to fit it into 40 minutes would be more than anybody could do. So I've chosen this interesting monument, which is the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba. So if we look at this building, you'll say, well, where's the cathedral? The cathedral looks as if it's sitting on the roof of the building, but in actual fact, the building sinks down into that mosque. The mosque was originally built, obviously, by the Muslims. We have the tower on the left-hand side, and now we're standing outside some of the entrance porticos. You could enter into the mosque from a number of porticos, and the first thing you'll probably notice is this is a very different type of architecture that we're used to seeing. And I'll just point out the arch. The arch is going to be fundamental in Islamic architecture because it's a Roman design, it's a Roman idea. The Romans invented the arch, but nevertheless, the Muslims used the arch in a particular manner to decorate, not just to show something which looked beautiful and was very attractive, etc., and very picturesque, but it became a fundamental part in their artwork. And as we move through the building of the mosque at Cordoba, we'll find that the cathedral is at the very center, but we have to approach the cathedral from the mosque because the mosque still remains. So in the 15th century, the mosque was taken over by the new king and queen, Christian queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel, and they converted it into a church. So at the moment, there's a big argument going on in Spain whether it should revert to being a mosque. That's a very difficult one, and it raises curious questions. Christianity and Islam are two of the largest religions in the world. They're almost neck and neck. Christianity has a very small majority at about 2 billion inhabitants, but Islam is catching up with 1.9 billion inhabitants. So these are the two largest curiously growing religions of the world. And again, a curiosity, it's interesting to think that 84% of the world's population profess some religious belief. In other words, they profess an affiliation or they are a member of one of the great religions. So that leaves around 16% of the population who are undecided, agnostic or atheist. That doesn't mean to say that they're on principle, they don't want to belong to a religion, but it's just through their own personal circumstances. They haven't become a member of any of these great faiths. I mentioned that the architecture was fundamental, and here I've found a little cartoon of the construction of a typical building, such as the mosque in Cordoba, which would date back to about the 8th century. And we find our little chap drilling away. You might wonder what he's doing. He's actually carving a capital, and curiously enough and interestingly enough, he's using the old Roman style of artwork. In the background, we have the construction of the pulleys and of the framework for the arches. So you can see this is the way that the workmen would build from the ground upwards, and then they made a wooden arch frame, and then into that they slotted in their bricks. And then that meant because the bricks were carrying the weight and spreading the weight across the building, that meant that you could have large open spaces just supported by very thin columns. And here is an example of what I mean. As you enter into the Mezquita Cathedral, into the Mosque Cathedral, you'll find in this part, we're actually in the mosque itself. So this was the entrance that a Muslim would have come into in the 7th, 8th, 9th, the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries onwards. They would have prepared for their prayers and they had space to pray. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll find this is an overview, an architectural plan for the cathedral Mezquita itself. So you look, you've got a large rectangle. That is the ground space, the floor space of the cathedral, with its entrance, which was a little patio, a garden, where people would wash their hands, wash their face, wash their feet before they entered into the sacred space of the mosque. This is just a rendering, a 19th century rendering of the building, but sometimes in architectural drawings you can see probably better than just looking at the photograph or the image itself, and you just think these are extraordinary builders because they're fantastic craftsmen. And one of the interesting points about the Islamic invasion or presence, we could say, in Spain is that the Islamic settlers contributed so much to Spanish culture, and if Spain had not been invaded by Islam, it would be an entirely different country. And indeed, Europe would have been very different, because if we go back into history once more for a moment, in 732, the Muslims pushed over the Pyrenees into Spain, and they intended taking over all of Galicia and of Gaul, that would be modern-day France, and probably keep going into Germany. That was the idea. It was all about conquering. It was both peaceful and bloody, because, as I said earlier, they wanted to have everybody alive. They didn't want to live in a city of corpses or a country where people were dead. They wanted people to cooperate. And Islam was very much a culture of cooperation and mutual support. But they were turned back from that endeavor by Charles Martel, Charles the Hammerer, and they retreated back into Spain, and therefore they redoubled their efforts at beautifying all of Andalus. Andalus is the general term, the land of the Visigoths, the land of the Vandals. That was the land that they said they came to, which was uncouth, and they brought in their own new form of religion, of language, of writing, of administration, of cooking, of gardening, of hydraulics, of sailing, of music, of numeracy, so many different things, which we'll see as we make our way through this extraordinary monument and through this extraordinary culture. Islam depends on a very simple submission to Allah, offering to help the poor, praying at least 5 times a day, and making a journey to the holy city of Mecca. And they're the basic fundamentals which everybody is asked to observe. So it's a relatively informal religion, which depends on the 114 verses of the Quran. And it's very much a way of living, a moral way of living, in order to attain heaven. So the Dome of Cordoba is the last piece we'll look at here. As you see on the left-hand side, we have a wonderful dome, which is all golden mosaic. And you'll notice it's very geometric. And this is one of the hallmarks of Arabian culture, of Islamic culture, because they had an extraordinary understanding of mathematics. It may look just beautiful, but if you work out the mathematics of construction there, you'll see how extraordinarily intricate it is, and yet they're able to turn a very ordinary structure into something absolutely magnificent. But then when the cathedral was taken over in the 15th century, the Christians decided they wanted to reduce it from being a mosque. They didn't knock it down, which was, I suppose, a temptation, and they decided that they would just absorb the building of the mosque itself, and they inserted the cathedral into the center of the mosque. And if we go to the center and look up into the air, this is the dome that we would find. And it's probably more familiar to Western eyes, at least, because this is the typical dome, and it's got the Gothic expression of architecture at this stage. So it's very, very slightly different. again, I mentioned some of the things that the Islamic world brought to Spain and as a result to different parts of the Mediterranean. One of the important people was a man called Averroes ibn Rushd, who lived in the 12th century, a native of Cordoba, and he was regarded as a great philosopher. But interestingly, of course, in those days, you didn't just say, well, I'm going to become a philosopher, I'm going to go to university. And even though universities were established at that stage, that wasn't one of the subjects really offered. You had to learn mathematics, you had to learn language, you had to learn rhetoric, you had to learn music, you had to learn writing, all these various different skills. And that would allow you become a thinker. But I often point out that the early Greek philosophers were fishermen, that in Miletus, for example, where the early Greeks began their philosophy, the original question was probably, what type of day is it going to be tomorrow? Because we're going to go out fishing. Is it going to be stormy? Is it going to be calm? Is it going to be a low tide or a high tide? All these different types of questions. Now, they then would lead you into questions about where does the sun come from? Does the sun go around the earth? Does the earth go around the sun? So it brings you into kind of philosophical questions which you've got to tease out in your mind. Well, the same with some of these great Islamic philosophers. They also were just looking at the concrete world. And curiously, they wrote books on medicine, they wrote books on architecture, they wrote books on navigation, they wrote books on a variety of subjects. All of this was the simple search for knowledge. And I've just shown a picture here of the court of Cordoba. Again, once again, it's familiar, but when we go into Granada, you'll probably see lovely architecture, but the buildings are entirely different. So I just wanted to take this artistic image and imagination of what Cordoba must have looked like when the buildings were furnished. So here we have Averroes, one of the great Islamic scholars, but also Moses Maimonides, another 12th century thinker, a native of Cordoba, even though he moved to Egypt where he lived and died. He was Jewish. And again, the population of Cordoba in its Jewish quarter was very, very, very small. And again, once more, if you think that in today's world, Jews only comprise 0.18% of the global population at about 14 million people. So it's still a small religion, and yet it has an enormous impact. It's one of the most easily recognized religions in the world. But Moses Maimonides, again, was a thinker. He was a doctor. He was a herbalist. He was all these various things. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Guide for the Perplexed, which is a really wonderful title for any book. And it's certainly, if you went into a bookshop and you saw that on the spine of a book, you take it down and glance through it. But again, these were some of the great thinkers of the time which we come across. And that leads us into the old synagogue of Cordoba, which was built in 1315. The reason we know that is because on our left-hand side, as we enter, underneath our lower slide, we'll find an inscription, which is the dedication giving us the year 1315 in which the small synagogue was raised. Spain had a very unfortunate relationship with Jews, which we're going to see in a few moments, but suffice it to say that in 1390, a pogrom against the Jews was initiated in the country. And this was because they were a minority, they were suspect. The majority were either Islamic or Christian. So there was a tension as well. And I think it's important to say, sometimes people talk about this as being a wonderful period when Jews, Christians, and Muslims all got on together. That's actually not quite true, because the period, if you imagine, of course, we've seen the Muslim invaders came in after 711 into Spain. Well, not everybody welcomed them with open arms. Now, as I've explained, the Muslim invaders were quite wise, because they tried to allow the native population continue on with their work, to continue earning money. And then all they wanted was a small tax, the jizis. They had a small contribution which would keep their administration going. But there was I think, always an uneasy tension between the three religions, and that is borne out by the history which we're going to see. This is just an example of a Spanish 15th century Hebrew Bible. And again, it's important to point out, and we saw this last week when we were in Oxford and in Cambridge, the importance of the written word for these three religions. We refer to them as the religions of the book, because for Christians and for Jews, the Bible, the Tanakh, or the Old Testament and New Testament are the fundamental books. And for Muslims, the Quran is the fundamental book. It's the passing on of teaching from one generation to the next. And just as Islam had its own script, which we're going to see in a few moments, the Hebrew language also had its own Semitic script and language. We move on from Cordoba over to the great Alhambra of Granada. If you'll excuse me, we're not going to go through all the various rules, the Umayyad, the Almoravids, the Almohads of the rulers of Islamic Spain, because it's quite complicated. One succeeded the other. And in actual fact, it also points out to us that not all the Muslim rulers were ruling happily together, because they were always vying for territory. And they were tribal, because even though it appears they came over as a group, as a single group, they didn't. They were absorbing tribes, they were absorbing languages, and also they were absorbing tensions. And for that reason, many of the people who were settling in this new land of Spain weren't always friends. They weren't, even in families, you'll find families disagreeing and falling out and separating. Well, the same thing with the Muslim invaders and settlers. Here is one of the most iconic buildings of Granada, and indeed of Moorish Spain, the Alhambra. It's a fortress, as you can see. It's set against the Nevada mountains. And again, it looks down towards the sea, some 90 kilometers south, but it nevertheless is sufficiently inland for the Muslim rulers to feel comfortable that they could look back and be comfortable guarding their back, and yet they could look forward at the sea. And the sea was going to be very important, in particular in a few moments, as we're going to see, when they looked over to the west, because that was going to be a route to new lands and the possibility of new conquests which never happened. As we move into the building, you'll find, again, exquisite workmanship. And once more, just observe that because of the cleverness and the skill of the builders, they were able to build relatively heavy mass on these light columns. And the reason for that is because the arch was able to disperse the weight. And this is going to be one of the things that, you know, I often think when we walk through these buildings, we just don't realize the skill, the careful construction that the builders and architects had to put into and the mathematical workings that they had to provide. But also you'll find these extraordinarily intricate carvings. And there's something in the carvings that you might not really see unless you were alerted to it. And one of those things is writing. So there's extraordinary decoration on these magnificent columns. At first, they just look like squiggles. The only way you can understand what they mean is if you look on our right-hand side, and you'll find two examples of Arabic writing. The lower one, of course, is the famous Blue Quran, made in North Africa on blue-dyed ink with golden writing. And again, it shows you the value that all these people put on the sacred writings. And therefore, all over the Alhambra of Granada, and indeed in many of the buildings, you'll find writing on the wall, writing carved in every single area. Now, in this particular picture, I had wanted to find a little curiosity, but I wasn't able to find it. So you'll just have to imagine on our left-hand side, if you can go down onto the ground, on either side, if you looked into the pillar, you would find a small little basin. And during the very, very hot and almost suffocating summers in Granada, the rulers were going to be very, very uncomfortable. So therefore, the servants were continuously pouring cold water into these little marble basins. And then as they did that, the water evaporated and went up into the area which you can see. And as it evaporated up, then it came down as a mist. So it's still done. They don't do it while tourists are there, but if you asked to see it, or you might find it on a video perhaps. But again, it just shows this was obviously air conditioning a la 13th century. And again, once more, we have this wonderful example of the capitals, which are laden down with beautiful scripts which are referring to the glory of the dynasty and the glory of Allah, the glory of God, which supports the dynasty. And once more, again, the very hot summers were unpleasant unless you could find somewhere cool and shady. And therefore, there were several halls within the Alhambra where you could enter and just sit during the heat of the day. And look, here we are in a room, and this view shows us into the stuccoed ceiling where the windows are. And that's a curious thing, because the windows were always left open. They were never sealed or closed, not even with wooden lattices. And the reason for that is because in the summer period, air could stream through the area of the cupola, which was always refreshing. So therefore, air could enter in through the doorway at ground level and then could rise up. The hot air rose to the top and then was expelled through the top. But also this created a very clever current, which allowed the people inside to remain relatively cool. And again, just once more, more calligraphic details on the ceilings, on the walls. And look, even the ceilings are covered with inscriptions. It's not simply just decoration, it's also Islamic script. Everywhere you look, it's all to the glory of the rulers, to the glory of God. And you're going to find that all over in many, many religions and many cultures, the rulers almost claiming that they are supported by God. And again, on our right-hand side, when you look at the artistic watercolor of the interior of the Alhambra, it gives you an idea of the extraordinary artistry. And I often think when we walk through these buildings as tourists, we sometimes are jaded. We see so much and we just think, what's this all about? But one of the important parts of the Alhambra, and indeed of Islamic architecture, is the garden. And in the Quran, heaven or paradise is described as a place, a garden flowing with water. And that's a fundamental contribution of Islam as well to Spain in the 7th century, because water was fundamental not only to hygiene, etc., but to health. And where you had stagnant water, where you didn't have access to water, obviously you had illnesses. And again, when you think of the Islamic scholars, they were bringing in herbs, they were bringing in medicine, they were bringing in even a simple thing like sutures. You know, when you get an operation or you have to have a scar sewn together, it was the Arabs who invented the silk suture. Now, we've had to leave the beauty of the Alhambra because unfortunately in 40 minutes we only have a few moments to swoop in and examine some of these wonderful buildings. I've come to Seville in this building and in this extraordinary construction. And again, once more, we're on a Roman site. This probably was an old Roman temple built between the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian era. Then it was taken over by Islam. And if you look behind at the very top, you'll find the old tower, which was the call to prayer tower. So the person given the task of calling the people to prayer would rise up and they would call the people 5 times a day just to remind them to pray towards Mecca and to make their submission to Allah. But again, this area was converted into a Christian church, but because the church was started, the original idea was in 1400, but it didn't start until 1434 for a variety of financial reasons, and it wasn't finished until 1517. So you'll find that it started in the Renaissance style, in the Gothic style, I should say, and finished in the Renaissance style. But as we go in, you'll be able to see the interior on our right-hand side. At the upper part, we've the crossing across the sanctuary, across the altar area, and below we've got a view down into the choir screen of where the canons and the religious would have gathered for their prayers. And you would be able to see that this is a typical Gothic building. And yet it's managed to keep its style. Once more, we've got the Giralda, the great tower for the call to prayer. But you can see again, it's a rectangle shape building. And again, behind the Giralda, behind the tower, you'll find a garden. And again, in the time when this was a mosque area, people would have come in, washed their hands, washed their face, washed their neck, washed their feet in order to be purified before entering into the presence of God. But the Christians then, as I say, built their cathedral. And I just draw your attention to this wonderful choir, which was made of carved oak. At the interior of the cathedral, every day there was Mass, the Eucharist, and there were prayers several times a day. So we can just see the wonderful rose window, similar to the rose windows which we saw in the cathedrals of Notre Dame and Chartres a couple of weeks ago. And again, I draw your attention to the bottom slide on our right-hand side, that enormous wooden carved altarpiece, which is gilded with gold. So gold leaf has been applied to that, and the gold is probably one of the early gifts from the New World, which we're going to come to in a few moments. In 1492, the Muslims were definitively expelled from Spain. At least they were deposed from the rule, and many of them converted. But also in the same year, 1492, Columbus finally got support from Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand of Castile and Aragon to make a journey towards what he wanted to find as the Spice Islands, a new route and probably a quicker and more economic route to go to the Far East. Now, unfortunately, he read his map incorrectly, and I just make a point in passing that one of the great contributions of Islam in Spain was the Portolan maps, the maps which laid out and tracked the coastland of the Mediterranean, and this was enormously important for trade. But Columbus set off, and as we know in the story, he discovered the Americas. So he headed off in 1492, and he began a series of journeys which carried on for a number of years. The first one, 1492 to 93, and then another journey, 1493 backwards, arriving in 96, and then another journey in 1498 to 1500. And this opened up the Iberian Peninsula, which consisted at that time now of Portugal and Spain. So the two distinct countries separated. Portugal was on the Atlantic side, much, much smaller than Spain, which composed the bulk of the Iberian Peninsula. But nevertheless, this also brought in two important things. It brought in money in the form of gold and raw jewels and gems and pearls, etc. But it also brought in slavery. And that was going to be an important part of the rest of European history for several centuries. When Columbus arrived, he didn't do a very fair exchange. Indeed, there's a whole host of stories about diseases which were introduced both to the New World and to the Old World. But basically, it was a story, while many Europeans would say, no, this was a story of mutual enrichment, etc. It wasn't. It really was a story of Spain pillaging the New World and not giving a fair treatment to the people themselves. But there was also another very sad incident which had taken place a few years earlier, and which was to really take off after 1492. In 1478, as the Christian rulers were taking over from the former Muslim rulers, many of the Jews and Moors, the Muslims, had been given the chance to convert to Christianity. And if they converted to Christianity, the understanding was they would be able to remain in Spain. Not all of them, of course, could be trusted as far as the Spanish officials were concerned. And there were neighbors spying on other neighbors, looking in through windows, etc. And they claimed to have seen people who were Jewish or who were Muslim, having pretended that they were Christians, having been baptized as Christians, still saying their Islamic prayers, saying their Muslim prayers, saying their Jewish prayers, reading the Jewish scriptures, etc. And the monarchs set up what is called the Spanish Inquisition, an inquisition to oversee the sincerity of these people. And in the first of the inquisitions, 6 people were burned at the stake for not being convinced and sincere Christians. And it's something which is almost impossible to believe. Although, again, I think if you turn on the news any day, either on television or on radio, you'll find extraordinary stories of racial intolerance, of religious intolerance, and it's nothing new. As the scriptures say, there's nothing new under the sun. Those were to continue as Spain established itself. And again, once more, the Spanish monarchs were imposing their rule. This time they weren't like the Muslims. They weren't just asking for a tax. They were actually imposing, and they were forbidding people to be Jewish or Moorish within their territories. They wanted a purely Christian territory. But I want to turn for a few remaining moments to look at some of the beautiful works which were produced in the Christian world also. This is a missal book cover, again dating from the late 14th, early 15th century. It's a gold cover studded with gems. And again, keep in mind, 2 of the things which the New World, the Americas, were to contribute in the 15th century into the 16th century was gold in vast quantities, which had never been seen before in Europe, and also precious and semi-precious gems. And these are placed on the cover of a prayer book, which is called a missal. These are medieval ciboria. They date from about the 10th to the 14th century. On our left-hand side, we've a very beautiful silver ciborium, which is gilded with gold and is in the Gothic style, while the 2 on our right-hand side are much more simple and in a Romanesque style. This 13th century cross is made of wood at the center, then is covered with beaten silver, and then gilt on gold at the edges. And the reason I showed this cross is because the cross was going to be one of the images par excellence of Christianity. And here we have a similar cross, but this time simply in polychrome painted wood. This is actually from the cloisters in New York. It's a reconstruction of a Spanish abbey. But again, it will give you an idea of what these items were like in situ, because not all of us can go to the places, especially at the moment when we're not allowed travel, but not all of us can see what these places were like in their original state. And if we just look at museums, sometimes we see things as they're laid out in a stall or as they're laid out in a shop. But here we can imagine what it must have been like going back maybe 8 centuries or so, 9 centuries, to see what a medieval abbey looked like. And again, some of the decoration. Here are 2 beautiful olive wood carvings. On our left-hand side is a statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus, with the infant seated on her lap. It's painted, polychrome statue. And these statues were enormously important, both in churches as means of helping private and public prayer, but also they were kept in homes. And on our right-hand side, on our left-hand side was Mary, and Jesus on our right-hand side, I should say, is St. James, who's the patron saint of Spain. And in the 9th century, it was believed that his body was discovered. He was one of the original 12 apostles, and it was believed that his body His tomb had been discovered in Spain, where it had been brought through a variety of circumstances, which we won't go into just for the moment. It became the great medieval pilgrimage center, the way of Santiago, Santiago de Compostela. And perhaps some of you have come across the way, the Camino, which now hundreds of thousands of people are traveling on once more. It was one of the most important medieval routes. I remember 40,000 people traveled through the city of Burgos per day in the medieval period. 40,000, if you can imagine what that must have been per day. So there's a huge industry of religious tourism, and that is beginning to perk up it's been perking up for the last 40 years or so. And at the center is an interesting piece. It's a pyx for probably holding the Eucharist. It was made by a Christian artist, but it's using Islamic style decoration. And that again is the cross-fertilization which we often find with Islamic art and Christian art, one touching the other, one informing the other. And again, we'll find here a 14th century Jewish Hadad. It's a religious book again. It refers to events in the scriptures. But curiously, you might look at this first of all and say, oh, is this not a Christian Bible? And again, you could be absolutely right for saying so, because it was produced in the time when Christians and Jews were working side by side. Equally, we could say about this ivory. Ivories have been carved from at least the first century of the Christian era, at least that much. And then they became extremely important and popular and dispersed in the 4th century, right up to about the 13th or 14th century. And here we have simply a Spanish ivory, which is possibly kept at home, a private piece of devotion. A wealthy patron would have asked for this. And it shows at the top, Jesus meeting the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection. And in the lower panel, and with an expanded version of that on our right-hand side, of Jesus meeting Mary of Magdala on the morning of his resurrection and saying, "Do not touch me yet, because I have not ascended to my Father." Finally, another piece of beautiful artwork, again, a little bit later from the 14th century. This is the time when Christian Spain is reasserting itself over Islamic Spain. And this is a beautiful little statue carved in oak wood. Again, polychrome. It's gilt with gold and it's painted. And it refers to a story that when Mary and Jesus were passing on a donkey, a pear tree leaned over to give Joseph the fruit, so he didn't have to stretch himself very far to take the fruit from the tree. This beautiful piece of work I thought was symbolic as well, because it unites what I've been trying to say in the last few moments of the unification of Islamic art and Christian art. So again, this piece was made by a Christian workman. It could have been a workwoman, I shouldn't say, because I'm not sure, but it was made by a Christian. And the reason we know that is because within the writing of the center are the words Ave Maria, Hail Mary. But again, it's using very much a style which had been popularized in Islam. And again, if you think back for a few moments ago when we were visiting Granada, the intricate work, we don't have the calligraphy, but we find the intricate decorative work. And especially keep in mind, remember back when we saw in Cordoba, the wonderful domed ceiling. Again, this is an example. This is the style that they had developed. And then finally, the fortress of Granada had to be abandoned. The last of the rulers was forced out in 1492 when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel took over as the rulers, and they set up their capital. They set up their palace in Granada, and this was the place where they wanted to rule from henceforward. And they contributed some buildings as well to the same time. At the same time. And the final painting which we come to is just again an artistic farewell, if you like. This is the submission of the Muslim ruler in 1492. In January 1492, you see the Alhambra of Granada in the distance on the hill, and at the center we've got King Ferdinand, flanked by his wife on a white palfrey with a crown and a blue mantle. And this is the moment in 1492 where the Spanish monarchs reconquer, because they didn't call it a conquering, they said it was the reconquering, the retaking of their country back from Islam. But I would contend that the weaving of Judaism, of Islam, and of Christianity has enormously enriched the country and the world. So thank you for your joining with me today, and I think in a few moments we're going to see a little bit more about the questions and answers which might be coming up.
Well, first of
I'll
all,
try my best to answer.
Father Michael, first of all, thank you very much for a truly illuminating presentation. I do agree with you. It is fascinating to see the merging of both Christian and Muslim religion in the far-flung reaches of Spain. So now at the conclusion of your presentation, we'd like to direct some time towards some questions, if you wouldn't mind. And I'm sure these won't pose any problem at all for you. So the first one I have, obviously taxes took the eye of Sharon Tock, where she's asking, were the conversions to Islam to avoid paying taxes when the Moors turned up?
Well, no, not really. That's a very clever question. In actual fact, the Muslims were very, very clever, because they had a small little tax, which I mentioned as one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and that's really a tax to support the poor and people in need. So that, if you like, is almsgiving or giving to charity. But the Christians and the Jews were obliged to pay a separate tax, which was called the jizya, and that tax was a small amount, set differently, but it usually amounted around 10 or 15% of a person's income or what they could afford.
Okay, I have a further question here from Jerry Anendo, who is in the Philippines. Father Michael, is there any particular reason that the cities were never renamed after the Christians regained the Golden Triangle area?
No, I don't think so. For example, Seville was originally called Esperia in Latin, and then it changed its name under Muslim rule, but it reverted to the name Seville once the Christians took over. So it had a more difficult name, which I can't pronounce, to be quite honest with you, under Muslim rule. But then it reverted to kind of what we would call modern day Spanish, Sevilla. So I don't think there was anything very notable about that, but the names of cities, as you know, are long established, and once people are used to them, they keep them more or less.
I have a further question from William Chang. He's asking if, and I think you've spent a lot more time than he's proposing, but if I only have a day each for the 3 cities of Andalusia, what would you recommend as the must-see sites of each of these cities, and what are your particular favorites?
Well, to be very honest with you, I think that's what I did, because I only had 45 minutes today. So that's why I chose these highlights. And I certainly would say in Granada, you've got to see the Alhambra. And in fact, in Granada, that's about all there is to see in a day. So you could certainly see that within 3 hours comfortably. Seville, I would certainly go to see the cathedral, because it's magnificent. But the whole of Seville is just so magnificent. I've been several times, and one of the things I'm really looking forward to when we're allowed to travel again is going back to southern Spain, because I just adore the country so much. And then finally, Granada, Seville, and Cordoba. I think if you went to see the mosque cathedral at Cordoba, it would knock you off your feet. It's absolutely stunning. Probably of the 3, it's the most imposing of the buildings, and it's so atmospheric. It's just wonderful. But if you've only got 3 days, I think they're what you've got to see. But the nice thing, and the reason I chose this and called it the Golden Triangle, is because it really is a set of 3 cities that people go to, even if they've only got maybe 3 or 4 days in Spain. It's very easy to get from one to the other. You can go by car in about 90 minutes between each.
I think once we're all out of various lockdowns on the planet, it probably is going to be a first place to visit. I've got a further question from Joan Fu Mahoney. She's asking, would you refer to the cathedrals of the Golden Triangle as Arab cathedrals in terms of the Moorish arches and fine calligraphy that you can see there?
Especially at Cordoba, yes, absolutely, because it's so curious that Cordoba, the exterior and the approach is the mosque. But then once you go into the very center, it suddenly opens up and you say, oh my God, what am I in now? And it's a Gothic Renaissance building. So it's so extraordinary just to arrive at that unexpectedly. So the basis is Arabic. And again, Seville, the same thing. It's built within the complex of an old mosque. But again, as I showed you in Seville, we've got a Gothic leading into a Renaissance building. So it's a hocus pocus. It's a jumble of styles, which makes it so absolutely fascinating.
And I think to cap off, I actually had one question. I think you might have just answered it. Generally, this type of architecture is described as the Mudejar style. Does it refer to any one particular architectural style, or is it a hodgepodge of everybody getting involved?
That's a very good question. I'd have to scratch my head and work that one out. I think probably it's basically Moorish. So in other words, I think it's important to remember that all that we have seen in Spain originated in the north of Africa, or even as far away as Saudi Arabia. So in other words, they're bringing in the Arabian context, as I say, through calligraphy, through painting, through art and architecture, but also what they've absorbed as they swept across on the westward journey. They went through, just think, Persia and the Roman Empire were fighting, and Islam took advantage of that and swept through them both. And shortly afterwards, both the Persian and the Roman Empire collapsed. And then they went over through the north of Africa and up into Spain. And what they created in Spain is something absolutely unique. The smells of Spain, as I've mentioned, all the various things, music, the textiles, the numeracy, the hydraulic equipment, the irrigation, everything they stamped on, to my mind, enriched the country immeasurably. And that's why, I suppose, in a sense, Spain is probably my favorite European country, because there's so much more than you would find. Forgive me for saying this, and I probably shouldn't say it, but there's so much more that you would find than in France or in Germany or in Austria or Italy. There are so many more layers. Let's put it that way, and it's got almost, I could say, more history than any of the others wrapped together.
Father Michael, thank you very much. I am amazed at your extensive knowledge of this, but of course, when I read your bio, you've spent a lifetime doing it, and we really appreciate the fact that you've been able to share some of your time with us today, and we will all walk away.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
I think at this moment in proceedings, we'll move on, and I would like to introduce to you Professor Lim Soon Hock, JP. He's past founding director and patron of the Asian chapter of the Patrons of the Arts for the Vatican Museum. Soon Hock tells me that he has been very blessed to be able to wear so many hats in his life. Apart from managing Plan B, his corporate advisory practice for over 20 years, he is a board member and senior advisor of several companies. He is also an adjunct professor with the National University of Singapore for leadership and entrepreneurship, and a mediator with the State Courts of Singapore, Singapore Mediation Centre, and Singapore International Mediation Institute. Despite his very hectic schedule, and I don't know how he finds the time, He's also managed to publish 5 books, which have helped to raise more than $1.2 million for 4 different charities where he is closely involved. So, with all good wishes, I would like to hand you over to Professor Soon Hock.
Good afternoon from Singapore, and thank you, Bruce, for the kind introduction. It is always a pleasure to be invited by Ben to share with you my personal experience as a patron of the Asia chapter of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museum. It is always very difficult to say no to Ben when he makes a request. Just like 5 years ago in 2015, when he asked me to help him set up the then Singapore chapter and to draw up the constitution. As we have to raise funds in support of a foreign beneficiary, notwithstanding that it was the Vatican, we needed to obtain approval from our local authorities, which we managed to obtain after several months of discussions. From the word go, no efforts were spared to promote PAVM, to sign up patrons, and to raise funds in support of PAVM and local activities. We were very pleased that within the first year, over 60 patrons were admitted, and we successfully raised over 50,000 US dollars to sponsor our first restoration, the Great Wall on Silt. Ben was, as usual, aggressive. He sets high goals for the local chapter, and we eventually raised over US $500,000 to build the entrance to the Carriage Museum, our first major project. Patrons who donated bricks at $15,000 per brick will have the unique privilege of a name mentioned on the wall at the carriage entrance. As it turned out, the plan for the entrance was revised, needing less money, and the excess from the funds raised allowed our chapter to contribute to the restoration of the Holy Stairs. God works wonders and in miraculous ways. Since becoming a patron, I have made 3 visits to the Vatican, organized by our chapter. It was spiritually fulfilling and uplifting, to say the least. I've committed to Ben that when my schedule permits, I will participate in future trips, which I regard as a pilgrimage of sorts, for me to continue to discover and to learn more about our faith. In my second visit, I managed to shake hands with our Holy Father at the regular Wednesday papal audience at St. Peter's Square. Needless to say, I did not wash my hands for 24 hours after that. I also had the opportunity to visit the Holy Stairs and to climb the steps on my knees all the way to the top of this pontifical sanctuary. I felt humbled and very blessed that I have God in my life. I now invite you to sit back and enjoy the spiritual wonder of the Holy Stairs in the video to be shown to you.
Patrons and friends, we are here at the Holy Stir. Emotional moment today. Our restorers are giving the final touches to this major restoration. It took 7 years to be completed. I can see their commitment, their patience. Often they work in very difficult positions and not very comfortable positions, but it has been a great emotion today to see this restoration completed after 7 years of work. I still remember the scaffolding in the central part. I still remember when we were talking with Paolo Violini about the beginning of this restoration, the difficulties, the chapel of San Lorenzo completed. And today it was, the wonderful image I have is the one of the pilgrims climbing up, kneeling on the wooden steps that were restored with the original wood of the 1800s. We gave back this wonderful artwork, this wonderful monument, this wonderful emblem of Christianity to the people. That's the most important thing. And we did that thanks to your help, your support, your commitment. Thank you very, very much. We look forward to welcome you here at the Holy Stir very soon.
Dear patrons and friends, we are arriving at the grand finale of a massive, colossal project. The Holy Stairs, the frescoes of the School of Paul Bril are now completed. This has been a project that goes back more than 20 years. The patrons' involvement goes back several years. So I'm excited to share with you some of the beauty of this wonderful restoration made possible by all of you, in a particular way to our restoration team at the Vatican. So I'm excited to really just celebrate this victory. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, we weren't able to be here in person, but I want to congratulate all of you for your involvement, for your dedication, for your generosity to make this wonderful restoration project possible. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed watching the video as much as I do and are inspired. It was possible because many patrons have donated to its restoration. APAVM, our chapter, contributed 100,000 euros to the restoration of the Holy Stairs. There are two compelling reasons why you may want to continue signing up and should as a patron. One, more than art, the Vatican Museum is a repository of history, cultures, and civilizations as depicted and captured by art, which we should preserve for the enjoyment and benefit of future generations. The educational value is priceless. For Catholics in particular, it will enhance and deepen our understanding of our faith as it progresses and evolves over the centuries since the birth of Christ. Much of these were captured in the splendid works of many artists, craftsmen, and artisans, such as Michelangelo, Raphael, etc. Two, the Vatican Museum has to support and fund the restoration and preservation of artworks in its large collection. This is because the Vatican City State sustains itself on museums, gasoline sales, and pharmacy and other retail sales. It has no taxation as it has no population to tax. Although the Vatican holding company, EPSA, has real estate investments in Rome and elsewhere, and sustains the operation of the new churches of the Holy See in almost every country and Secretary of State operations, it is separate and autonomous from the Vatican City-State. As you can see through my sharing and from this slide, you will get invaluable benefits and experiences as a patron, and will enjoy in art and art history education, in spiritual development, in knowledge and experiential learning, in building friendships and international bonds, as well as in your personal growth and fulfillment through the contributions that you will make. Allow me, therefore, to make a personal appeal to existing patrons to renew their subscriptions, many of which are expiring in December 2020. This is renewal time. It would be wonderful to get more multi-year renewals which are offered at good discounts. I hope I've also touched your hearts of many of our attendees who made time to attend this lecture series. I invite you to join APAVM and to journey with us in our enriching and enlightening endeavor. Many of you attending this lecture series are non-patrons. I urge your support. If you have found the lectures educational and enjoyable, do join APAVM as a patron. As you can see from this slide, the fees are relatively modest. A new corporate membership has recently been introduced. A subscription of $10,000 offers a 2-year membership for 5 named patrons nominated by a company. The membership is not a company membership per se, but specifically for 5 named individuals nominated by the company. Many may choose to join APAVM via their companies, which means that they can expense off as an employee's education and or benefit, like the club membership, thereby enjoying tax breaks not possible with individual memberships. In conclusion, it is good to know that APAVM raises funds from patron subscriptions. 70% of the membership fees goes directly to a restoration fund. Through this fund and generous major contributions from our patrons, the Asia chapter has to date raised over $1 million to support 6 restoration projects. Our next major fundraising is for the Bramante Courtyard, which Ben will talk more about in next week's lecture. Thank you for lending me your ears to my sharing of my personal experiences as a patron and what inspired and motivated me to join as a patron and to contribute in my own small ways. I invite you again to help us to keep our mission alive. God bless and have a pleasant day ahead. Thank you.
Professor Soon Hock, thank you so much. I think every day that I have been a patron, I personally take an enormous amount of joy out of what is a wonderful endeavor to preserve our art, our history, and the journey of mankind through its architecture. So at this point in time, I think it's almost time to bid you all farewell. But before we do that, I would like to welcome you all again for the 4th and final lecture next Saturday afternoon at 3:45 p.m. Singapore or Hong Kong time, and to once again enjoy the words of Father Michael on this art history. I think I may have dropped out for a moment there, everyone. So again, just to bid you all farewell and to welcome you back again next Saturday afternoon at 3:45. We have travelled through the architecture of France, Notre Dame Cathedral, across to England, and then on into Spain. And finally, we will wrap up being in Rome to experience the architecture of Bramante, and in particular the Bramante courtyard. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the week ahead.